Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. We continue our work today, and it's year 9 of the war and day 272 of the full-scale invasion of the Russian aggressor. And now we will be talking about the situation in our borders. Our speaker today is Andriy Demchenko, the spokesperson of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine. Mr. Andriy, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can you please tell us what's going on in the borders and what's the dynamics of enter to and exit from Ukraine of Ukrainian citizens? Good afternoon all. I want to mention that the units of the National Border Guard of Ukraine continue defending the land in all the areas where the active warfare is going on. Besides, our servicemen provide security in the borders where the situation is not less tense. In the front lines, the border guard servicemen hold their positions under constant bombardment by the enemy in coordination with other military units, repel the enemy attacks and use all the exhaustive actions to effectively repel the aggression of the Russian Federation armed forces. The situation is most complicated in Bakhmut and Avdiivka areas, where the enemy focuses its attempts on offensive actions. In Kherson region, the border guard service units are engaged in service in block posts and stabilization measures. Our units work in a coordinated manner under the command of the General Staff of Ukraine. In Chernihiv and Sumy region, Russia unfortunately doesn't stop the armed provocations. On a daily basis, the territories are being bombarded from the territory of Russia. The enemy concentrates fire using mortars, small arms and cannon artillery. Also aviation and UAVs are involved in these actions, which pose threat not only to the units located in those areas, but also to the civilians, because these bombardments result in destruction of the civil infrastructure and residential areas in the areas close to the border. The most bombardments are concentrated in Sumy region and Chernihiv region. Within a day, the enemy can strike from 10 to 20 times per day in those areas, which means dozens or maybe even hundreds of shells falling into Ukrainian ground. Within a month, we documented about 170 shellings, mostly by mortar in those areas, and 3 bombardments using aviation. The border guard services, in coordination with other military units, take all the necessary actions to reinforce the defense and to avoid enemy penetration into Ukrainian territory. The units conduct reconnaissance, build reinforcement installations, and set up block posts where our servicemen fulfill their duties. In the borders with Belarus, there are no significant changes of situations. The situation is under control, and the units of the armed forces of Belarus, who were reinforcing the borders on the Belarusian side of the Ukrainian border, as they say, that they cover their part of the border from us. However, we don't observe any changes in either number or nature of actions of these units. However, as it was mentioned before, Belarus unfortunately continues to support the armed aggression of Russian Federation against Ukraine, providing their territory, their infrastructure and their airspace and there is a constant threat of missile strikes from Belarus. And we all know, we all remember and understand that this is the direction that the loitering drones may be coming from as well. We also document the activities of electronic warfare equipment to complicate the operation of the border guard units of Ukraine, and the equipment used on Belarusian side of the border. They jam their radio networks used to operate the Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles. Ukraine does not create any provocations on the border with Belarus, unlike our neighbors. Meanwhile, Belarus tries to shift the responsibility to Ukraine and to accuse Ukraine of any violations of the border, but we keep emphasizing that Ukraine did and will keep doing everything to provide our security on that area. Lately, it was surprising that the border guard of the neighboring country are being surprised with us fortifying our borders, which probably means that they forgot how the Russian convoys were coming to a country from their territory, and it was not surprising for them back then. Both Russia and Belarus escalate the situation, creating the joint forces of the United States, so to say, and we all understand that the separate forces of the Russian Federation are being brought to Belarus as well. And in Belarus, currently we don't see any creation of a strike force which could pose a threat to us anywhere near the border of Ukraine, but the actions of Belarus and Russia are aimed at escalation of the situation, and we do not decrease our alertness in that area. As to the border with Moldova and countries of the European Union, the general passenger flow was quite dynamic. The average number of both entry to and exit from Ukraine is 80,000 people, and it did not fluctuate much lately. It was about 50-50, and we don't document any mass either entry to or exit from Ukraine by Ukrainian citizens. In average, more people exit from the country in some days, but on some days the entry to Ukraine is more than exit. And the passenger flow, we could say, even decreased comparing to October, 5%. And as I mentioned before, between September and August, the decrease was 10%. If we analyze the situation starting from the 24th of February, due to the closure of number of passage points in Belarus and Transnistria section of border with Moldova, the largest number of citizens crossing the border are in the border with Poland, which accounts for 52% of the total passenger flow. We also advise the citizens before crossing the border, try to track the load on the checkpoints, because in certain days there is certain accumulation of the vehicles, because people sometimes try to leave the country at the same time. So using the information resources, and in particular the Facebook page of the Regional West Command. They have updated information. They update the information every 3 hours, and people can find the information regarding the passenger load on the checkpoints. We also call everybody to get themselves familiarized with this information in order not to face any difficulties during crossing of the border. On a daily basis, our servicemen refuse the cross of the border to around 150 persons, and the majority of this figure are men which fall under restrictions during the martial law. At the same time, dozens of violators who try to infringe the border are being detained in both green part of the border, green sections of the border, which is beyond the border checkpoints, and also the people who try to use the counterfeit documents. More than 7,600 such violators were detained starting from 24th of February, and more than 3,600 were detained for using of counterfeit documents or trying to live in otherwise illegal manner. The violators tried to cross the border in the sections of the border with Romania and Moldova, as well as Hungary and Poland. In October, there was a tendency to decrease of the mentioned violations, which was related to the work done by our units and in coordination with other military units, but also due to the worsening of weather conditions. Thank you. Mr. Andriy, regarding our border with Belarus, we all seen the video. We've seen the wall being built in the border between Ukraine and Belarus. Do we have a plan to build a wall like that along the whole length of the border between Ukraine and Belarus? Okay, let's avoid the term the wall. It's an engineering equipment, and one of elements may be a fence. It may be of different kind. It may be something like you talk about. It can be concrete, but it may have other nature. It can be a net, for example, a fence. But again, I have to mention that Ukraine understands the threat posed by Belarus through the pressure of Russia over it, when Russia tries to actively involve Belarus in a full-scale war against our country. So this is why we were doing and we keep on doing everything to reinforce our border with all elements related to engineer equipment. This work is being conducted by the forces of Ukrainian Border Guard Service, but we also appreciate the help of local governments who get actively engaged in this process, in the process of reinforcing the border. And we have to understand, so apart from the fencing, it's also the destruction of possible ways which can be used by enemy material to move through the border, but it's also mining of the locations in the most threatening, most dangerous locations, but it's also the installment of fortifications so that the forces which reinforce the border, I mean the Border Guard Service units and the armed forces of Ukraine and National Guard, so that they have cover in case of invasion or shellings, where they can take shelter, or during the full-scale warfare to effectively repel the aggressor's attack, to have it understand they're not welcome here. What are the restrictions for the civil populations who live in the areas adjacent to the borderline? All along the borderline with Belarus, in every region, our border guard service issues certain orders on the restrictions, which includes the approximation to the borderline. So it's completely restricted for the civilians to stay near the border, and as well as any works like recreation, hunting in different distances from the border. You can only stay near the border if there is information of the State Border Guard Service with relevant consideration of the application and relevant permit. Yana Demchenko, Ukrinform, I have a question. Is everything enough during the winter period? Is your preparation to the winter season is all right in Border Guard Service? Well, talking about the supplies for our units, this work did not start just now. This work started way earlier, so the measures are still being taken, but all of our servicemen are provided with necessary equipment and uniform to enter the winter season in a proper manner. Any more questions, dear friends? As to the violators you mentioned, who tried to cross the border without proper documents or cross it through the border checkpoints, we understand that probably such people use some documents, some exemption documents. So which are the documents being counterfeited in a widest manner? When people are being refused to cross the border, it doesn't necessarily mean that they use the counterfeit set of documents. They may not have the full set of documents which allow them to cross the border, or they don't fall under the category which allows them to cross the border. However, there are violators. Some may counterfeit the certificate of death of their wives, for example, because the single fathers are allowed to cross the border, or some incapacitation documents, and we transfer this information to the law enforcement bodies, so the persons are being brought to criminal liability, because there is administrative liability for illegal crossing of the border, and there is criminal liability in a number of cases, specifically for attempt of using counterfeit documents. Besides, our investigation units, together with other law enforcement agencies, we find the organizers who try to make some money on those people who attempt to cross the border. Thank you, Mr. Andriy. Dear colleagues, I will remind you, we had Andriy Demchenko join us, the spokesman of the State Border Guard of Ukraine, and right now we're preparing our schedule for tomorrow, so follow our announcements. We trust in our armed forces, and glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.